Hey everybody, Jay Widener here. Reality check. Back again. Sorry I missed last week. I had technical problems. We're reading from A Monument to the End of Time, my book that I wrote with Vincent Bridges. Last week was the week before that we missed was Bright is the Noble Work. And now this is section 6, The Philosopher's Church. Among the crowd at the consecration of the Abbey Church of St. Denis on June 11th, 1144, was a young Parisian student on his way up through the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Maurice de Sully's early history is sparse. Born in Sully-sur-Loire of humble parents, he apparently studied in the Abbey of Fleury and came to Paris around the age of 17 to study at the university on the left bank. Along with most of Paris that day, Maurice would have followed the pilgrim route of St. Denis's martyrdom from place of his torture on the eastern end of the Ile-de-Cité to his jail cell near what is now the Flower Market, and then on to climb Mount Martre and to Martyrium on its height. From there, it was a pleasant walk down to the Abbey. Along the way, some of the pilgrims also discovered that their faith had been answered, that they had been healed by St. Denis. We can imagine the 24-year-old Maurice pushing his way into the new church to catch a glimpse of the Mass of Masses, celebrated by 19 bishops before the gilded altars and served with jeweled vessels by the great and powerful of the age. The abbot himself thought that the crowd believes themselves to behold a chorus celestial rather than terrestrial, among divine rather than human, unquote. It had its effect on young cleric Maurice. In less than 20 years, Maurice de Sully would rise from obscurity to become the Bishop of Paris and a confidant of kings. Along the way, he would plan a new cathedral to replace the aging churches on the Ile-de-Cité. The new cathedral, dedicated to Our Lady, would rise over the ruins of the ancient temples to Matrona and the Celtic Mercury, as well as Childebert I Merovingian cathedrals. When Clovis I established Paris as the center of the new Frankish Christendom, the church still honored the traditions of its mystery school origins by making a distinction between those who had been baptized and those who had not. The unbaptized were asked to leave before the sacrament, and so most early churches had a covered porch where the unbaptized could depart without disturbing the rest of the worshipers. In the 5th century CE, this developed into the habit of building two cathedrals, or seats of episcopal power, one for the unbaptized believers and the other for the elite, the partakers of the sacrament. And so Childebert I built two cathedrals on the Ile-de-Cité. St. Etienne was the larger church of the common congregation, while its companion, the smaller Church of Our Lady, served the inner core of the baptized elite. Thus, from its very beginning, Notre Dame de Paris had been the initiate's church. We might even suspect, given the altars found in the crypt in the 18th century, that the inner core of the Merovingian church adhered to some very peculiar concepts of Christianity. Notre Dame served as a connection point with the very ancient mysteries that Christianity was supposed to supplant. The Merovingian Notre Dame was destroyed by the Viking assault of 856 CE. It was quickly rebuilt and served as a rally point for the successful defense of 885-86. From then on, St. Etienne lost its stature, and the episcopal seat was firmly established at Notre Dame. Unfortunately, we have no contemporary description of the Carolingian church, and not a stone remains to suggest its appearance. The site was chosen by Maurice de Sully for his new style cathedral and stripped down to its Roman foundation. Planning began in 1160 as soon as Maurice was elected Bishop of Paris. The cornerstone was laid around the spring equinox of 1163 by the visiting Pope Alexander III. The Pope, a refugee in France from the Church's first French-Italian schism, publicly officiated at the consecration of Saint Germain des Prés, the former church of Saint Vincent and the Holy Cross. A private ceremony was held to lay its cornerstone of the new cathedral, and Bishop Maurice began to build with gusto. The choir was completed and the high altar consecrated in 1182. The Patriarch of Jerusalem preached the Third Crusade from the half-finished Notre Dame de Paris in 1185. By the time Maurice de Sully died in 1196, the nave was done except for the roof, which was paid for in Maurice's will. Excuse me. Work began on the western facade around the turn of the 13th century, and by 1220 it was finished up to the level of the Gallery of the Kings. The flying buttresses were added around 1230 as the nave was reconstructed. Chapels were added between the extreme buttresses as the southern tower began to rise above the gallery. It was finished in 1240 and work shifted to the northern tower. The towers reached their present height by 1245, and the first bell, Julime, was installed in 1248. As soon as the reconstruction of the nave was completed in 1250, work began on the transept facades. They were finished by 1270. The next 20 years saw chapels and flying buttresses added to the choir and the chancel rebuilt. Except for the interior, major work on Notre Dame de Paris ended soon after the turn of the 14th century. Although the construction continued for a century after his death, Maurice de Sully may be considered the guiding intelligence behind the entire project. The western facade was designed and even sculpted long before work began. Some of the sculptures were done in the 1170s, soon after consecration on the cathedral started. The transept facades were designed later, but they were inspired by the same mystical vision that inspired Maurice. Although we have evidence of Templar sponsorship only for the porch of St. Anne on the southern tower of the western facade, it seems somewhat coincidental that all the major work on Notre Dame halted, leaving the original design unfinished, just as Philip IV suppressed the Knights of the Temple. The 150 years from the consecration of St. Denis to the suppression of the Templars defines the main arc of cathedral building movement. The impulse faded away into the 14th century, leaving cathedrals such as Notre Dame unfinished. The Black Death in the second half of the century seems to complete the process. The Gothic buildings of the 15th century are small churches such as Jean de Boucherie, built by Nicolas Flamel, and private houses such as Lalemant Mansion in Bourges. Clearly, the vision went underground after the disasters of the 14th century. But Notre Dame de Paris remained. A history of France could be written around its rise and fall in the national consciousness. The choir screen was finished just as the Black Death swept over Europe. Paris suffered an eclipse of fortune, as did all France, during the 100 Years' War. This struggle between Capetian France and Plantagenet England was actually backed and promoted by the opposing sides of the Templars-Cheyenne schism. Notre Dame de Paris, saw the funeral of the mad King Charles VI, who had repudiated his son in favor of the English in 1422. 9 years later, in 1431, the English King Henry VI was crowned King of France in Notre Dame Cathedral. Unfortunately for Henry, in those 9 years, Jeanne d'Arc, a vassal of René d'Anjou, had rewritten history. After her example and the tactical skills of Duke René lifted the siege of Orleans, Charles VII had been crowned at Rheims. In 1436, he liberated Paris from the English. For the next 346 years, Te Deum was sung in Notre Dame on the first Friday after Easter to honor the deliverance of the capital from its English occupation. By the time Charles VII died in 1461, nothing remained of the Plantagenet France except the poet of Calais. His funeral, like his father's, was held at St. Notre Dame de Paris. The 15th century continued to hold the venerable cathedral in respect, but the winds of change were blowing. It was during the lifetime of Charles VII that the word Gothic had first applied to the Lex Continuana style of St. Denis and Notre Dame. The Italian self-proclaimed universal genius Leon Battista Alberti misunderstood the Abbot Singer's reference to Goth in his medieval sense of Jewish and assumed it meant rustic from the barbarian Goths who sacked Rome in 410 CE. From this, he dismissed the style with exuberance of form and imagery as a product of the fantastic tastes of the barbarian. Fulcanelli informs us that this canard has survived the centuries when the more exact term might be ogival for the style's pointed arches, because it does reflect the inner meaning of the cathedral's truth. However, the idea of the medieval as barbaric was one that was much in tune with the tenor of the Renaissance and its emphasis on classical forms. The 16th century saw the old cathedrals as symbols of the church's power and influence. And as the protests against the Church of Rome grew, the cathedrals, including St. Denis de Paris, felt the brunt of the assault. It was sacked by the Huguenots in 1548 and was the scene of the beginning of the St. Bartholomew Days massacre, the marriage of Henry IV and Marguerite de Valois in 1572. Religious wars paralyzed France for 80 years. Louis XIII promised in 1638 to rebuild the main altar of Notre Dame if he had an heir to the throne. Later that same year, a Te Deum was sung in the old cathedral, marking the birth of the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. Eventually, toward the end of his long reign, Louis would honor his father's request and rebuild the altar. During work on the crypt in 1711, a series of Gallo-Roman votive pillars were found, and it is from these images that we gain a glimpse of the spiritual antiquity of the spot. In general, through the 18th century, though the 18th century was not kind to the old cathedral, renovations damaged much of the original interior. The stained glass was removed from the choir level, and the rose windows were remodeled. And then, of course, came the revolution. The cathedral became the temple of reason, and much of its ornamentation was destroyed. The kings of Israel were toppled from their gallery by the citizens of 1793, and the western facade was severely damaged. Napoleon restored relations with the church and crowned himself emperor at Notre Dame in 1804. His son was proclaimed king of Rome in the cathedral at a solemn Te Deum in 1811 as Napoleon planned a vast invasion of Russia. Within a few years, Napoleon would go into exile twice. The monarchy would be stored and then overthrown again. The election of Louis Philippe as king of a constitutional monarchy in 1830 marked an uprising in the fortunes of Notre Dame. The 1820s and 30s saw the first wave of the Romantic movement, and a young writer, Victor Hugo, used his romantic sensibilities to shine a light on the medieval exuberance of Notre Dame. Published in 1831 as Notre Dame de Paris, the novel was an immediate hit and launched a craze for Gothic architecture. English readers know it as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, after its main character, the bell ringer, Quasimodo. But the novel, in truth, is about the cathedral itself. Set in the 1480s, the book captures the transitional moment when the traditional forms gave way to the modern. the books of stone to the pointed page, to the printed page. One young Parisian influenced by Hugo's novel was a 17-year-old architecture student, Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. In the next 30 years, his name would become synonymous with the Restoration. While still in his early 20s, he was appointed to the National Commission for the Preservation of Historical Monuments. There was a new feeling emerging thanks to Hugo's Romanticism about the relics of the past. The head of the commission, Prosper Mérimée, best known to us as the author of Carmen, noticed the young architect had directed his training in the subtleties of medieval engineering. Soon, Viollet-le-Duc was handling the commissioner's difficult projects, sometimes as many as 20 at once. In 1843, he was appointed architect for the restoration of Notre Dame de Paris and spent the next 20 years on the project. No one could have been better prepared for the task. The cathedral that we see today, and as described in Fulcanelli, is really Viollet-le-Duc's reconstruction. From the top of the reconstructed flèche, where a statue of St. Thomas bears the likeness of Viollet-le-Duc, throughout the entire fabric of the cathedral. The touch of its restorer is apparent in everything. The Gothic has been refracted through the lens of Romanticism and to purists such as Fulcanelli. The result is somewhat pallid. However, the reconstruction restored Notre Dame de Paris to its rightful place in the national consciousness. Joan d'Arc's beatification, the first step to sainthood, was celebrated at Notre Dame in 1909. A Mass Te Deum was sung for the armistice of 1918. By the time Mystery of the Cathedrals appeared in 1926, Notre Dame de Paris was publicly venerated and privately ignored. The official separation of church and state in 1905 had cast religion in France into an intellectual backwater. Fulcanelli's work drew attention to an aspect of the cathedral that was in danger of being forgotten. The romantic Gothicism of Viollet-le-Duc contained and concealed an important philosophical teaching. Fulcanelli identified it as alchemy. Today, walking across the broad parvis in front of the western facade, armed with a good French guidebook and a copy of Mystery of the Cathedrals, one is struck by how massive the cathedral looks. It is hard to imagine as we watch the tourist bus come and go, loading and disgorging waves of visitors from around the planet, how the cathedral appeared in its youth. Gustave Doré left us a glimpse of the old congregation on the Isle de City in the illustration to Rabelais' Gargantua in Portugal. The gentle giant looms over the hemmed-in towers of the cathedral and its crowded surroundings like a cloud, and we catch a brief sensation of how it must have felt to stand in the narrow medieval parvis and look up at that massive facade and its soaring towers. Walking close, we find it is possible to stand at the edge of the new parvis and see in one eyeful the entire western front. The impression it makes from this distance is not so much one of power, but of subtlety and refinement. Harmonics leap out at us, and we feel the unity of the design. If God is the supreme architect, then man could do no less in honor of him. With that thought in mind, it is possible, at least slightly, to feel the faith of the cathedral builders. When we turn to Fulcanelli, we find that his selection of symbolic images to illustrate focuses our attention almost exclusively on the western facade. The seal of alchemy, Fulcanelli's first image in his Paris chapter, can be found on the base of the central pillar of the great porch, the Porch of Judgment. Our guidebook agrees, with a question mark, however, calling it both philosophy and theology as well as alchemy. The other 6 images around astronomy, rhetoric, geometry, grammar, and music, philosophy, whether theologically or alchemical, it is indeed the overview required to understand the other 6. It is at this point we call our attention away from the Porch of Judgment. Then a climb to the viewers is in order. On the northeastern corner of the southern tower, we find Fulcanelli's second image, the Phrygian capped alchemist. As Fulcanelli suggests, he is watching over his work and staring intently at one spot deep in the interior of the cathedral. Interestingly enough, both of these sculptures, Alchemy and The Alchemist, are restorations by Viollet-le-Duc. A fascinating photo survives and may be seen in the Notre Dame Museum of Eugene Viollet-le-Duc of Eugene. We'll do that again. A fascinating photo survives and may be seen in the Notre Dame Museum of Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, standing with an enigmatic smile next to the restored alchemist, who, seen face on, appears deeply shocked by what he sees. Returning to the ground level, we find that the rest of Fulcanelli's Notre Dame images can be found on the western porches. The next 22 are on the basement or lower register of the central porch, the Porch of Judgment. The guidebook calls them virtues and vices, but offers no insight as to how these meanings apply to the obscure symbols. To give it credit, the guidebook does mention Fulcanelli and the possibility that these images may have something to do with alchemy, even though it doesn't agree with its theory. 4 images from the porch of the Virgin to the left of the central porch, and the last image from the porch of St. Anne to the right, Fulcanelli uses the central image on the porch of the Virgin as an example of the planetary metals, without mentioning the legend which the scene depicts, the resurrection of Mary. As we contemplate this inexplicable gap, the light begins to dawn. Fulcanelli is choosing his images to form or reflect a predetermined pattern. He is not concerned with the tales and legends, except that they can be used to demonstrate his point. His last Notre Dame image is the perfect example of this selection process. The central pillar of the Porch of St. Anne contains a sculpture of St. Marcel, the Dark Age Bishop of Paris who defeated a local dragon. Fulcanelli goes on for 5 pages before he mentions the legend. Along the way, he gets in a few shots at restorers who added romantic flourishes. However, Fulcanelli insists that the very key to the mystery of alchemy is contained in the decorative details of the original plant and the dragon. In this image, it is the dragon that is important, not the saint who overcame her. Our conviction grows that Fulcanelli is choosing his images carefully to describe a much larger process than just turning lead into gold. Walking back across the Parvis, we turn once more to look at the western facade. There is so much more information at this cathedral, so many more stories. Why did Fulcanelli focus on just these images? He augmented them with images from Amiens and other places, but the heart of the mystery must be here, we feel, bound up with the mystery of Notre Dame itself. Fulcanelli left us clues, however, but those clues were hidden within mystery of the cathedrals. The next step was to unravel Fulcanelli's message and then to see how it applied to the cross at Hendaye. This is a picture here of the alchemist on the roof of Notre Dame with his hat. And he's watching over his creation of the cathedral and what the cathedral is doing. And I think it's important to know that Fulcanelli isn't saying that everything in the cathedral is alchemical. He's saying that just certain images are. And then he's pulling those images out and showing us. And we're going to go, as we go through the rest of the book, you'll see that the dragon is really, really important for figuring out the quality of time, which is what this is really all about. Anyway, that was a long one. And thanks for sticking with me. And I'll see you next time. I'm Jay Widener. This is Reality Check. And I really, really appreciate you guys watching. Thank you.